Hello and welcome back into part 4 of our notes on the French Revolution. Today is our final chapter where we're going to be talking about the rise of Napoleon and how he rises to power, but then also the fall that comes after his defeat at the Battle of Waterloo. So let's get into our notes here as we finish out the French Rev. Again, Napoleon is an individual. He's from Corsica, and I wanted just to show this here on this kind of zoomed in map. Corsica is one of these islands in the Mediterranean Sea to the southeast of France. So when we talk about Napoleon, he is a Corsican. He's born in 1769. By 1789, he joins the National Assembly's army when the revolution began. By 1795, he leads an army that stops rebels from taking over the National Convention and basically becomes the hero of the hour in France. Why? Because he's seen as the savior of the Republic. That his army that stops the mob from attacking the National Convention essentially is able to save things and keep the peace. He is named general by the Directory because of this, and is basically responsible for fighting many different victories in Europe. He's seen as this daring military virtuoso, and again, is considered a hero by most people in France. He's respected by those in power as well. And this bodes well for Napoleon. Why? Because again, 1795, the defense of the National Convention basically elevates him to hero status. And while there's some things that take place in between then, uh, especially his failure in Egypt, we see that basically Napoleon is able to kind of spin the narrative that he is this hero and is a force that can control the French people and the French government. And what happens is that by 1799, Napoleon takes his armies, surrounds the legislature, and forces the Directory to be dissolved. He then becomes, or is voted on, and becomes what's known as the Consul of France. Now, effectively, this is just Napoleon taking a title as dictator. And he gets this title from what we call a coup d'etat, which is a term, again, that refers to literally a blow to the state, but is used now politically to talk about any sort of forceful takeover of power. And Napoleon is basically able to use his power both militarily and diplomatically to end any wars with other European powers by 1802, which is a huge thing and really is what a lot of people in France are clamoring for because they want peace and stability at this point after so many years of revolt. In 1800, there's a vote again that is called a plebiscite, which is just a fancy term for a kind of popular vote of the people, and they overwhelmingly vote to give Napoleon power in the new constitution. And again, his first task really is to fix the economy. Uh, he's moved away from a lot of the foreign policy issues going into the early 1800s, and his big task off the bat is to fix the economy. It's been the reason that a lot of people in France have been struggling for so long, so he creates a fairer tax system, and he also smooths out the efficiency of it. He creates a national bank as well, so that the economic issues that really spurred the French Revolution are cemented moving forward. He roots out corruption in the government, removes those corrupt leaders, as well as does some other programs focused on society in France. We see that he creates public school systems. He creates what's called lycées, which are these schools where they would train public officials uh, so that they would be able to govern as well. He limits the church's power at this point as well in France, more so as an effort to consolidate power under himself. Arguably, the greatest achievement domestically of Napoleon is he creates this system of laws called the Napoleonic Code. And the Napoleonic Code essentially eliminates a lot of injustices, tries to basically create a more fair system in France. But in the process and in exchange, he creates a system where freedom of speech and freedom of the press are greatly restricted. So essentially, the trade off is again, in exchange for handing over individual rights, we see that Napoleon is promising law and order and stability. This is a big callback to Thomas Hobbes, if you remember from the video that we talked about with the Enlightenment. Hobbes argues that this is kind of the social contract that takes place in a lot of these systems where you have a Leviathan or you have the monarch that's in control or the sovereign. Now, while this is all taking place, we also see that Napoleon is going to be busy in terms of foreign policy. Napoleon, by 1804, officially has been crowned emperor. He crowns himself emperor, but that's his new title moving forward here. He's the Emperor of France. One of the big things that we see basically because of the French Revolution, though, is this crumbling of colonial holdings by the French Empire. 1789, there's a big and very important event that takes place in the Caribbean. And this is a revolution at what is called at this point in time Saint-Domingue, which will be now currently known as Haiti. This is a revolt that was started really by slaves uh, and led by an individual named Toussaint Louverture. And the revolt in Haiti at this point in time is a topic for another day, but was a groundbreaking independence movement because it was one that was fought and won by former slaves and Afro Caribbeans in Haiti. Now, Napoleon wants Haiti back, even though that they were able to emancipate a ton of slaves on the colony. What we basically see is that Napoleon wants it back because the sugar industry in Haiti was the single biggest industry globally at this point. They exported so much sugar, it was basically a cash cow for the French economy. And Napoleon wants that back in the fold. Actually ends up sending a bunch of troops there. They're ravaged by disease to the point where they're really not able to put up a meaningful fight, and Haiti actually gains full independence as a sovereign nation from France at this point in time. Now, Napoleon really cuts his losses here. He spent a ton of money on trying to get Haiti back. They already are in a position where they don't really have money to be spending on these conflicts. So ends up cutting his losses altogether, really, in America, and sells the Louisiana Territory to the United States at this point. This is in part to get money, but it's also because the French have this ongoing pettiness with the British. And basically, you see this that quotation down at the bottom where they say, this assures forever the power of the United States, which is pretty prescient at the time, but again, kind of underscores the fact that this was seen as a way of making sure that the British don't regain any foothold in North America moving forward after this point, as well as funding future endeavors by Napoleon. And this is where Napoleon turns next. While he's been at peace in Europe, he's going to turn his attention here. During this time, he had already done some small moves to kind of bolster the size of the French Empire. He annexes or basically incorporates the Austrian Netherlands, so the areas that'll be kind of present day Belgium, parts of Italy, as well as installs a puppet government in Switzerland. So basically, you start to see the kind of borders of France growing. Britain's the one that's the most worried about this. They see the power that Napoleon's amassing and they start to ring the alarm bells. Britain, alongside of Sweden, Russia, and Austria, they all ally to fight against Napoleon. And Napoleon starts growing his empire now that he's at war. Wins several key battles across Europe to the point where he extends and amasses the largest European empire since the Romans. Now, while this is a big empire, it's still a very unstable empire. And that's really where we start to see some of these cracks moving forward. One of the other big things that happens as Napoleon's building this empire, basically moving to 1812, we see the Battle of Trafalgar, and this is a naval defeat off the southern tip of Spain. The British Navy meets up with the French Navy, and British Admiral Horatio Nelson, he is able to maneuver and actually split the French fleet into two. He's able to capture a series of ships and effectively, basically, take any teeth, any bite that the French Navy has out moving forward. Now, the effects of this are long term, but also in the near term as well. Long term, the British Navy basically becomes the naval superpower for the next 100 years, meaning that they have superiority over the seas. Napoleon also, in the near term, has to scrap his invasion plans. He had thought about trying to invade Great Britain over the English Channel, but now that naval superiority is a problem, that basically takes it off the board. But Napoleon's not going to stop there. He's going to look for other territories as the empire reaches its height. Now, Napoleon is one of history's kind of most power hungry and egotistical individuals. Now, any leader that crowns himself emperor probably has a little bit of an ego and feels very sure about their own abilities. But we see that Napoleon's ego and confidence starts to be his downfall. There's a couple of things that he does that are considered mistakes historically. The first is called the continental system. And basically, what that did was Napoleon, now that he controlled big pieces of territory in Europe, he tried to close European ports and trade to make it so that they had to basically trade with France and that they would trade just on the continent. This system was basically something that was very antagonistic towards the British, and in return, the British, they decide that they're going to blockade the European continent. And what this looks like is that ships that come through that would come to the blockade would be forced to go first to a British port. They'd pay taxes and get inspected. And this was seen as a really big problem for Napoleon economically. It's also one of the reasons that the United States goes to war with Great Britain in 1812 over these searches and these taxes or tariffs that are put in place. We also have the Peninsular War. Napoleon, in order to try to make sure that this system, this continental system worked, he wanted to invade Portugal. Now, the problem was that he controlled loosely parts of Spain, but really did not control some of the Spanish revolutionaries that were there. And these Spanish revolutionaries or guerrilla fighters were able to kind of do these small ambush attacks on the French army to the point where they're successfully able to kill about 300,000 men from the French army. Now, while all of this is happening, Napoleon is planning for kind of the big grandstand. And this is the thing that most people view as one of like the key downfalls of Napoleon is that Napoleon sets his eyes on Russia. And to the tune of about 420,000 soldiers, Napoleon commands to march on Russia. And the goal is basically to take the vast territories of Russia and incorporate them into his massive empire at this point. Now, the thing is that the Russians use defensively what's called scorched earth tactics. They essentially burn fields, they destroy cities, so that as they're retreating back further and further into the interior of Russia, the French army wouldn't really have any supplies that they would be able to take. They wouldn't have any shelter. So you essentially were draining them of resources by making them import stuff all the way across the continent from France. Now, what this looks like, again, is that you see places like Moscow that are actually destroyed itself as an effort to try to stop the French army. The French army marches on Moscow, and they march there basically as winter starts kicking up in Russia. And as you'd imagine, the winters in Russia are pretty stark. And what this really forces the French to do is that due to a lack of supplies and the fact that they're essentially surrounded in a city that's been destroyed, they're forced to retreat. and they're forced to retreat back through Russia in the middle of the winter, to the point where the 420,000 soldiers that went in during the offensive on Russia, you only see about 10,000 of those soldiers remain after Napoleon retreats. And this is where the downfall really starts to spiral. Why? Because basically you have a weakened army and soldiers that are still in the army or that are newly conscripted or drafted or added to the army. They're very unexperienced. They're inexperienced soldiers and they're not really able to win any battles. And because of this, Paris is captured in 1814. Napoleon's generals, they decide, hey, it's time, you need to give up the throne, and they force him to surrender. Now, because of this, Napoleon is banished off the coast of Italy to what's known as the Isle of Elba, and we see that King Louis the 18th assumes the throne. So the monarchy is back, but relatively unpopular in France. In a daring maneuver, though, Napoleon actually escapes and returns to France. And because of the fact that King Louis XVIII was so unpopular, he essentially returns to France as a hero and is able to marshal enough of an army and gains his soldiers moving forward. The problem is that in 1815, the European armies that had fought Napoleon once are done with him, and they've been done with him. And they marshal their armies up in the Low Countries of Europe. And on June 18th, the Battle of Waterloo takes place. Napoleon is finally defeated again and is banished even further this time to the island of St. Helena, which is in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, which you can see here labeled on this globe here, basically in between South America and Africa. Napoleon will end up dying in St. Helena of what is believed to be cancer in the remainder of his days. So again, that is what we have for kind of the rise and the fall of Napoleon. And we'll talk more in future units and future videos on what happens after Napoleon basically blows apart Europe moving forward. But this effectively ends our chapter on the French Revolution. That Napoleon, in some historians' minds, is kind of the punctuation of a long, bloody, and violent revolution where Napoleon rises basically due to the mob's desire for stability and order. There's other people that say that this is kind of a separate chapter, but again, I'll leave that up to you. So thanks again for listening, and thank you again for paying attention as we go through these notes on the French Revolution.